I'm Sophie Volp, Chair of the Center for Chinese Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to our annual Elvera Kwang Siam Lim Memorial Lecture. This endowed lecture series was made possible through a generous gift to the center by Mrs. Lim's family to honor her dedication to scholarly exchange. With this endowment, we bring one eminent scholar to Berkeley each year. Elvera Lim was born in Guangdong province in 1928. She was sent to Hong Kong to attend high school and later received her undergraduate degree from the University of Hong Kong. After receiving her PhD from the University of Hawaii, Mrs. Lim took a position in the biology department of the newly established Chinese University of Hong Kong, where she remained until her retirement in 1989. Our speaker today is Rana Mitter, St. Lee Chair in U.S.-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. Professor Mitter is the author of several books, including Forgotten Ally, China's World War II, which was named a Book of the Year by the Financial Times and The Economist. His latest book is China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. His documentary on U.S.-China relations, The Great Wall, is available on BBC Sounds. Rana taught at Oxford until 2023 and is a fellow of the British Academy who has been awarded the Medlicott Medal for service to history by the UK Historical Association. Welcome, Rana.
Sophie, thank you very much indeed for your very kind welcome today. And thank you to everyone who's gathered here together, some old friends I know and some, I hope, new friends by the end of our discussion today. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to join you, not least because I know the distinguished history of the Lim lecture. I feel very honored to have been invited to give that. Also because we have a wonderful sunny late February day, which is not something that you tend to hear in Cambridge, Massachusetts as a sentence that people tend to utter. So having an excuse to try and absorb at least some sunny rays before heading back to the freezing temperatures to teach next week is an additional pleasure as well. I wanted to spend a little time today talking about an aspect of a research project that I'm currently doing, and then I hope open up to Q&A and discussion. And what I'm going to try, I hope, to persuade you is that some aspects of a relatively forgotten period of Chinese history, even amongst those, and I see at least some in the audience who are very expert on Chinese history, perhaps tend, in my view, to underrate. And one of the reasons that I will give, I hope, in terms of the importance of that period is that it relates to a whole variety of developments that I think are of increasing importance, not just for China's relations with the United States, but also with the wider world. Of course, as I've suggested in my chosen title here, Turmoil, Taiwan, and Truman will be three of the elements that I put together in talking about the late 1940s. Now, I found myself wondering, I gave the title a little while ago, how many of them still have relevance today? Turmoil, well, it is possible that one or two elements of turmoil may be seen in geopolitics, possibly within the last 45 minutes, as I haven't actually checked my phone since then, but who knows what's happened. Taiwan, I think it's fair to say, okay, one way or another, perhaps that is still something that has a certain amount of contemporary significance. Truman himself was, of course, taken from us way back in 1972, President Harry Truman. But of course, if I, for a moment, if I were a little taller, place my hand across the last two letters and just left the first four, then you might be able to find the name of someone in that same position at a later day who is more relevant to the present day. On the other hand, we'll see whether or not that historical resonance actually maintains itself. Many things have been said about contemporary politics, but the connections with Harry Truman perhaps have not yet been as obviously put together. So we'll see if there is something there that we can link. I want to start with a quotation, though, and it's not, in fact, from Harry Truman. It is, in fact, from a young woman, the daughter of a significant politician of the late 1940s in very late Republican China. And this was the daughter, in fact, of the then foreign minister of China under the Kuomintang nationalist government, the daughter, in other words, of Wang Shijie, who served as foreign minister in that administration from 1945 to 48. And this is a sentence that Wang Shijie got from his daughter and put into his diary. And although most of the diary is in Chinese, he was a fluent speaker of English and of French as well. He took a PhD from the University of Paris, and therefore, on this particular occasion, this English quote was put in from his daughter, which she sent to him to encourage him. And he wrote the following words that had been given to him by his daughter. She said, "Don't be afraid of opposition. Remember, a kite flies against, not with the wind." And this was written down for her father rather charmingly very shortly before, in August 1945, Foreign Minister Wang Shijie got on a plane with his delegation from Nanjing and flew off to do negotiations with Joseph Stalin. And I have to say that compared with that, even this morning's spat in the White House between the current president of Ukraine and the vice president and president of the United States might have seemed like a little minor disturbance. Going to negotiate with Stalin, I think, counts as full strength as opposed to necessarily the perhaps more watered down version that eventually may emerge in our present day. The reminder that the negotiations with Stalin took place at that time indicates, I think, something that is worth remembering: quite how much of the world of 1945, just as with our own world of 2025, was in flux at the time. And rather like our current geopolitical movement, it was deeply fluid, and often the outcomes that emerged were extremely unexpected in many cases. But what I think has not been sufficiently explored in the midst of what is, no doubt, when one looks at a library shelf, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of titles in various languages about the end of World War II and the emergence of a post-1945 world. In all of those, the role of China as a player in that particular set of negotiations and reorderings of the world remains, I think, relatively understudied. And it's something that I have wanted to examine over time and have been working on for quite a while in a wider sense, in a period that I have preferred to call the Chinese post-war. This might seem like an obvious thing in one sense to call it, but I think it deserves a little attention, because if the period, let's say from 1945 to 49 or early 1950s, is thought of by most historians of China at all, then it's thought of as the period of the Chinese Civil War, the period when a crumbling nationalist Kuomintang regime is finally brought to the ground by a violent revolutionary insurgency under the Communist Party. But the presence of those years as a marker of the end of the war against Japan, as opposed to a prelude to the establishment of the People's Republic of China, I think changes the focus in some ways that I believe to be important. And of course, one cannot, indeed would not, want to remove the reality of China's brutal civil war, particularly the phase from 1946 to 49, that essentially marked a turning point in that particular period. But at the same time, thinking, as I think is helpful to us as historians to do, about which aspects of the trajectory towards China's present-day global incarnation emerge from perhaps the more familiar starting point of 1949, and which emerge from the, for China, perhaps less familiar starting point of 1945, is a valid and I think worthwhile framing, or at least I hope to suggest that that is the case. The term post-war itself, as one word, also, I think, bears greater scrutiny. It was, for instance, the single word used by perhaps one of the single most important works that synthesized and discussed the importance of that period and that framing in the European context, and that was the book Postwar by the late Tony Judt, one of the most important interpreters of European politics of the era. It is also, as we have, I'm sure, here many Japanologists, as well as those who have made China their business, a very long-standing term in the context of understanding Japan, the term sengo literally being post-war, whereas the Chinese equivalent, which certainly exists, jianhou, is not in and of itself as frequently used as an explanatory term. And yet, thinking about the Chinese post-war, the years after 1945 in their own terms, exposes a whole variety of shifts of great significance, aside from the inevitable reality of the Civil War. It marks a new phase of internationalization. It marks the emergence of China as a sovereign member of the new United Nations, and not least as one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. It was also, in terms of ideas, a moment of immense flourishing, a time when China and its elite thinkers became embroiled in some of the biggest global debates about the links between economic and social development. It was also a time of ideology. And that, by the way, I think is one of, just as a passing note, one of the questions that I still wonder about in our own very turbulent global moment, whether or not it is one that genuinely is about some form of ideological shift, or whether it is about raw power and its uses. In 1945, I think it is very fair to say that ideology and power were inexorably linked, and that China was very much at the center of those debates. There were debates in China about democracy and what it might mean in the Chinese context. And do not forget, of course, as I'm sure we would not do in this room, that the years 1946 and 47 marked one of the great constitutional debates in Chinese history, culminating in a constitution which, of course, because of the Civil War, was only promulgated for a very short time on the mainland, but continued in a rather anomalous form, of course, on the island of Taiwan, all the way actually in its existing form up to the late 80s and early 1990s. And beyond that, of course, there were immense debates in China, but also outside in comparable states, about what a powerful new ideological force in the countryside might mean, that force, of course, being the rising power of the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, it was a period when some of the debates were remarkably similar, or at least cognate, to those of the present day, and in other important ways, I should hasten to add, remarkably different. The China of Xi Jinping, today's China, is not by any stretch the China that Mao Zedong took over in 1949. Today's China is global in ambition and indeed in reach. That China, back in 1945, was recovering from the aftermath of 2 huge wars, first against Japan and then, of course, between the Chinese themselves. Today's China is a consumerist society. That earlier version was marked of necessity much more by austerity. Today's China is indubitably an innovator in technology. The earlier version was desperate to find international support to create its own technological base, whether from the United States during World War II or the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I go into this detail because, short though this period is, and the years between 1945 and, let's say, about 1951, 52 were a remarkably short period in historical terms, but they are becoming of increasing interest, I think, to historians both in China itself and in the wider world. And the interest, I think, is in 2 parts. One is questions of interest within the historical profession, but the other set is very much an engagement of ideas that shape China's contemporary domestic and international politics. And to give you some illustrations in just a few minutes about how that continuity and how that change interact with each other, I've drawn on historical materials relating to a figure with, I think, important insights into geopolitical and ideological change during that period. If we have more time and wanted to broaden the focus, I wanted to keep it fairly focused today, I would love to tell you more about some of the figures I've been reading from and reading about in the last few years. young women who join the Chinese Revolution from the countryside and keep diaries of how their own identities, both as revolutionaries and as people coming to terms with a very different mode of dealing with gender, are an important part of that period, or else a different set of debates about China's constitution in 1946 and what it actually meant at that point to be a democracy and how those questions were debated. They are all part of the rich seam of historical change during that period, but I mention them at this point merely to put them aside and concentrate, as I've said, on one particular figure today, Foreign Minister Wang Shijie. I'm not going to talk very much either about the really major figures of the time, Mao, Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jieshi, and others. They are, of course, immensely important. But I think at some level, by looking at the second tier or third tier or fourth tier of what seems to be global significance, one can learn a very great deal, much of which I think is new. So let's get to some of these figures. So here is a picture of the man I've been mentioning, Wang Shijie. He had, as you see, a good and long life, or at least he had a long life, and I think it was mostly a good one. He was Foreign Minister of China, perhaps one of his most significant jobs, although he was, in fact, later on, Taiwan fans will know, I think, president of the Academia Sinica, the Zhongyang Yanjiuyuan, as well, in a later period. It's up to you to decide which was the greater honor, of course, between the two. Wang Shijie was an intellectual, relatively a liberal. He was a constitutional lawyer, and his PhD from the University of Paris, as I've mentioned, was indeed in that particular subject. In other words, he was that kind of internationalist intellectual with which Chiang Kai-shek's regime had often a love-hate relationship. It was quite possible, as many here will know, to be a liberal intellectual in the 1930s and 1940s whose end fate was grisly. You might be shot in the street, arrested, executed, all of that. Or you might be hired. Another figure who was a parallel in some sense, the great historian Jiang Tingfu, who spent time, amongst other things, at Harvard, giving training to John King Fairbank, who, of course, will become the doyen of China studies in America. And Jiang Tingfu became perhaps unusually more liberal over his life, but maintained a string of important positions under Chiang Kai-shek, ambassador to the Soviet Union, director of the China National Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, ultimately China's ambassador to the United Nations, while not necessarily sharing the more conservative or reactionary politics of much of the party with which he was associated. And Wang Shijie, likewise, was perhaps more closely involved. He was a full minister within the government, but maintained many of his liberal values during that particular time. And I think that one of the reasons that he was given that space to do so was that he himself saw that he was most influential at a period when new possibilities were opening up for China, but also recognizing that the 1945 moment was one of deep vulnerability for China as well. Bear in mind the paradox, the anomaly, that in summer of 1945, nearly 80 years ago, at the time of the Japanese surrender at the end of World War II, China was simultaneously stronger and weaker than it had been perhaps for a century. It was stronger because it enjoyed the prestige of being one of the victorious Allied powers. It had, actually technically since January 1943, essentially full sovereignty for the first time since the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 at the end of the Opium Wars, which had imposed famously unequal treaties upon it, and that had come to an end. And yet it was, of course, immensely weak because it was a polity that had been nearly destroyed by bombing, refugee flight, financial disaster, and in general, the forced circumstances of its ruling government having to flee 800 miles up the Yangtze to set up a temporary capital at Chongqing from 1937 to 1946. So it was a period when, as well as physical dislocation being central to China's fate at this time, Previous assumptions about mentalities also had to be rethought. In other words, it was not enough to rebuild China's railways and roads and infrastructure. Its people also had to be refashioned. And while this is a commonplace in terms of what we know about after 1949 and the political project of the Chinese Communist Party, it is often, I think, underestimated how much the existing regime, at least in some parts of its elite, wished to actively to take part in a post-war refashioning of China under the existing system of government. But let's find out a little bit more about what Wang Shijie had to offer at that time in terms of new thinking on China's place in the world. A quick reminder, again, I suspect that there are many very expert, in fact, I know there are many very expert people in this audience, but for the few perhaps who don't entirely recall this period of history, let me take 2 minutes just to remind us of the various milestones of history during this period. First of all, of course, the war, the Titanic War against Japan, the Chinese theatre of World War II, ended unexpectedly suddenly in August of 1945. Almost immediately, negotiations began potentially about a coalition government between the Chinese Communist Party and the Nationalists, the Kuomintang, in 1945 to 46. Although during that period, clearly the negotiations did not get very far. This was off the back of the Sino-Soviet agreement in August 1945. I mentioned that Wang Shijie was flying off with his daughter's blessing to negotiate with Stalin and others as part of the Chinese delegation to the Soviet Union. And much of the aim of that time was to try and create some sort of agreement that would essentially prevent Stalin making greater claims on Chinese territory. So a sort of backstop agreement that would enable the Kuomintang government to feel confident about its Soviet border and be able to turn more towards consolidating its other borders and territories. China at this point becomes a permanent member of the new United Nations Security Council, which had been formed after the signing of the UN Charter in June 1945. And then much of 1946 is spent with a legendary figure of the US Army, General George Marshall, trying to broker a coalition government between the Nationalists and Communists and failing ultimately and returning home at the beginning of 1947. We then have famously a civil war that racks the country for 3 years with the culmination in 1948-49, 3 great campaigns by the communist armies that ultimately pushed towards the conquest of all of China. And then by 1949, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, are in charge of the mainland. The last sort of outlier, Hainan Island, is taken early 1950. And of course, the nationalists have fled to Taiwan. Chiang Kai-shek, his leadership, some 2 million refugees or exiles, you might say, going with him, and most of the most important contents of the National Palace Museum, which of course are still very much in Taipei as we speak. So that story, I hope, is reasonably well known. But now let's turn back to the question of what, at the time, as opposed to in retrospect, Wang Shijie and others involved with trying to consolidate and adapt the nationalist project were seeking to do. And this is a moment where I think actually starting from 1945 rather than 1949 has its uses. Because in 1949, of course, you have a moment that looks as if it starts from zero. The turn towards the Soviet Union, the split from the United States, the outbreak of the Korean War, and the anomaly of Taiwan continuing to represent the Republic of China in the United Nations. And because the type of analysis, distinguished figures such as Professor Chen Jian would be an example, starting in 1949, essentially make that first period from 1945 to 49 a kind of stub, a leftover of the previous regime, rather than a period of importance in its own right. But some of the elements, including China's presence in the UN, actually end up having relevance and continuity across the 1949 boundary. And some of the threads of negotiation that Wang Shijie took part in, I think, illustrate claims and ideas that will begin at that point and will come back to be reclaimed by the PRC many, many decades later. So in his first 3 years in his first year in office, 1945 to 46, Wang Shijie was part of at least three major negotiations. The first, as I mentioned, was the negotiation with Stalin in Moscow to get the Sino-Soviet agreement. The second was as part of the coalition government negotiations between the CCP and the Kuomintang. The third, this of course heavily involved Marshall and Truman, Truman's support for Marshall going in and essentially trying to mediate between the two sides. The third set of discussions related to areas that I think have been much less well covered up to now in historical discussion. And they relate to Wang Shijie's attempts at this very fluid time in geopolitics to stake a claim for China as a global player in the post-war world. To steal the famous words or phrase of the later US Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, not just to be present at the creation, the title that Acheson used for his memoirs, not just to be present at the creation, but also to take a stronger role in the creating of an order that would ultimately stretch across continents. Bear in mind that Wang Shijie, like most Chinese at the elite level, whether nationalist or communist, absolutely believed that the immense sacrifices that China had made during World War II, including the number of dead of 8, 10 million or more, including the deaths from famine in Henan and other disasters that have been caused by the war. Also, the refusal of China to surrender in the early years of the war in 1937-38, that all of these were a price that China had paid, meaning that the world now owed a debt to China in return. And therefore, Wang Shijie was not embarrassed about pushing very extensively for not just a regional, but a global role for China's influence. In other words, pushing hard for the idea that China should have an influence not just on the Asian peace settlement, but the European one as well, and repeatedly pushed for the right to sit at the table with all the other European allied partners. At the same time, and turning in the other direction and picking up the zeitgeist of 1945 as what you might call an early post-colonial moment, Wang Shijie was also interested in finding new modes of engagement with leaders in the non-Western world. China would, of course, be a mentor to many of those countries, but also potentially a leader as well. And as I'll go on to say, Wang Shijie's daily schedule, his negotiations, and his discussion on his meetings within Asia show aspects of that particular project as well. But the principle that if the Western world and the Western allies were going to be able to decide what settlement was appropriate for Asia, that therefore in return, Asia must have a role in shaping the West, was an idea that was very dear to Wang Shijie's heart, and particularly for him on the grounds that even if China was now a sovereign state with its own seat at the top table at the UN and indeed in the allied foreign ministers' meetings, it was also unique pretty much in being there because, of course, apart from Thailand, there were pretty much no other sovereign Asian states at the time, and other states emerging out of colonial rule, such as India, had not yet reached that particular stage, and others, Indochina, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, were actually returning to colonial rule at that point. So that gave an extra urgency to the wider anti-colonial project and the desire to suggest influence in Europe that Wang put forward. So at the Foreign Ministers' Conference in London in September 1945, Wang Shijie buttonholed some of the major figures of the allied world in terms of foreign policy. Ernest Bevin, the British Foreign Secretary, James Burns, the then US Secretary of State, as well as the man on the left there, the Soviet Foreign Minister, the hardliner, even by Soviet standards, Vyacheslav Molotov. And in doing so, he pushed forward cases on very specific issues where he thought that China ought to have a voice and a role. So, for instance, one of those was the idea of trusteeship, United Nations trusteeship, for the former North African colonies of Italy located in Libya, Tripolitana, and others. He also put forward ideas about how the Allied powers might jointly manage Japan. Molotov, in return for hearing about China's plans for Libya, fired back and pushed for a kind of grand bargain in which the Soviet Union would get China's support for taking some part in the joint management of Japan. Wang Shijie said no to this. He understood that this would alienate the United States, but he understood the importance also of keeping the Soviets on board in his discussions and negotiations. As well as talking about issues such as the dispensation of European colonies as part of his wider remit, Wang Shijie also drew on China's own experience in the very, very turbulent and troubled 1930s and 1940s to make arguments about how the post-war dispensation in Europe should be worked out. So, based on his experience, or rather of his witnessing of the invasion and occupation of Dongbei, northeastern China, Manchuria, in 1931, he argued against a French proposal in 1945 September 1945, to separate off part of northern Germany as part of the post-war division. And Wang Shijie said in his diary, I said that that wasn't right. If the people who lived in that region did not desire to separate from Germany, then they should not be made to do so. And then he went on to say in the diary, I talked about the principle of nationalism. So this is my translation of 民族主义的道理. Which should not be, he went on to say, which should not be neglected even on the territory of your enemy. Now, this strikes me as really quite an interesting thought at this point. It's 1945, a moment at which the Axis lie in ashes, where the victorious Allied powers can essentially do what they want. The understanding, the desire of the French for revenge on Germany is perhaps understandable at this point. And Wang Shijie is making this really rather powerful point, I think, that even if you think in the short term that carving up your enemy's country is a good idea, in practice, nationalist ideas, patriotic ideas are so strong that this would be a dangerous thing to do. And again, the experience, of course, of China, which he regarded as a country that had been clearly very badly damaged during that period, but had managed to come through the war and bring itself together again through that principle of nationalist feeling, was something that he wanted to share in that particular environment. He would continue to insist that China's views were heard on European questions, going on in October 1945 to insist that, as he put it, China must not be excluded from discussions of the Balkans and then of the settlement of Italy itself and the questions around Trieste. It was, although clearly not welcomed by the British, the Americans, or indeed the Soviets at that time, seen as part of the wider bargain they had to make to allow Wang Shijie's voice and the voice of China to be heard, at least in those negotiations. The following year, at the follow-up Foreign Ministers' Conference, this time in Paris in 1946, Wang Shijie began to see, though, the way in which his Allied counterparts would begin to pressure China and try and push it away from the idea that it should spend any time discussing the questions of Europe or issues further away geographically from its own backyard. And the way they did this was to essentially point more and more attention to the growing crisis of the civil war within China itself. James Burns, in particular, asked about this a great deal. But having said that, Wang Shijie's lobbying still paid off, and it's notable in the diplomatic records of the time that China continues to get a space, at least, to be asked about its views on the European situation. And again, speaking about Europe, Wang Shijie made points that were drawn from his own experience as a Chinese who had lived through the invasion and occupation of China, arguing that, quote, reparations for the European peace treaty must not be too harsh so as to avoid the reactionary forces in the defeated countries reviving and democratic forces being unable to rise. And this was a statement where he was talking very specifically about a group of European countries and the settlement that might be placed upon them. He had in mind Italy, Hungary, Finland, and Norway in particular. He also pushed forward, as I've said, the post-colonial case, and on the Italian colonial question, which kept coming back during that time, primarily again on North Africa, he pushed his case further than he had even in 1945, saying at one point, quote, one section of the colonies should be made independent or placed in United Nations trusteeship, and they should make preparation for independence in a short and limited time. So the anti-colonial or anti-imperialist element of Kuomintang politics, which had always been there, was very much put into active rhetorical service at that time, even though China, as a relatively weak and vulnerable state, was not in a position to put much finance or military force behind its ideas. But moral suasion was certainly something that China felt it was entitled to use at that point. Now, the point I'm making, of course, is not an argument that China was a major actor in shaping the Balkan or Italian settlement or the arguments over post-war Scandinavia. Clearly, that would be a stretch to make as a case. What is important, I think, is to understand that the narrative of entitlement to be able to speak on global matters because of the sacrifices made during war was laid down very, very early on. And while the passage between the 1940s and the 2020s is a long and tortuous one, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, it's nonetheless the case that today's China seeks influence in a whole variety of places that have not been in China's traditional areas of immediate contiguity. The Indian Ocean, where blue water naval projection is now possible for China's PLA Navy. The Arctic, which is becoming more and more of an area of concern to a global China. In other words, today, the idea that China might have views or influence in places where its geography does not automatically give it neighbor status is becoming commoner and commoner. But to some extent, that first agenda began to emerge even as early as the 1940s, in that particular case because of the credit that had been gained by China as a result of its wartime exercises. In other words, Wang Shijie was using the most powerful narrative available to him, that China's resistance against Japan for 8 years was pivotal to the global war that had just been won, and that now China had the right, and indeed the duty, to exercise that global role. In other words, the beginnings of a policy which, had things gone otherwise in the Civil War, would have been part of a trajectory to become more powerful in the international structures which were just being built at that point and which were still quite fluid or quite flexible in terms of how they were going to emerge. There were also more active and more forceful attempts to try and create a stronger Chinese presence in the region. And one which certainly continues to have contemporary significance happened right there in the South China Sea. I don't think I need to tell again anyone in this room that the South China Sea continues to be an issue of immense geopolitical sensitivity and confrontation in the present day. And indeed, many of the documents which emerged in the 1930s and 40s are cited today by China as evidence in making one case or another about the ownership or control that should be exercised in the region. But Wang Shijie, certainly as foreign minister, put forward a very strong case that China should make claims in the region. And here he's talking about the Paracels archipelago, Xisha, where he says, and you've got the quote there, but I'll just give it to you, in his diary on the 18th of January 1947, we have always claimed the Xisha archipelago as our territory, but we have never yet sent officials or sent workers there to stay on a regular basis. And again, in later years, as you'll know, the putting of Chinese and indeed other nations' military and workers, both on the natural islands and the artificial ones, has become a large part of South China Sea territorial policy. So going on with Wang Shijie, he says, the French government recognizes these as Vietnamese territory. After Japan's surrender, we sent a small number of troops to the important island at the heart of the archipelago to occupy it. Recently, the French have sent a military ship to the island to scare our troops who are resident there, but after my intervention, they withdrew. This is going to be a dispute between China and France. Now, obviously, many things have changed in the years since then. Clearly, the end of French colonial rule in Southeast Asia meant that this is no longer an issue in which France is involved. But the question of sending warships, sending troops to occupy South China Sea islands, and using essentially a combination of diplomatic and military confrontation to try and resolve the issue is again something which is entirely visible within this strategy that Wang Shijie is putting forward in the Kuomintang years. The main difference at this point being that the Kuomintang, as an ally of the United States, was not going to receive much pressure from the Truman administration in a way that clearly today the People's Republic of China, as a competitor to the United States, is getting a great deal of pushback on its tactics. But the tactics themselves are by no means dissimilar on either side. And this more confrontational side of trying to claim territory and to establish boundaries in the region also dovetailed with a much stronger post 1945 push, one that developed through the 1930s and into the war years, in nationalist China, in Kuomintang China, portraying itself as a leading power in the newly emergent post-colonial Asia, particularly at a time, as I mentioned, when the vast majority of Asian states which had been occupied by the Japanese were not given independence immediately after the war, but in many cases returned to European colonial rule. So amongst the figures who came to visit in the years after the end of the war with Japan included significant figures from places like Siam, Thailand, but also leaders of the new anti-colonial nationalist movements that were emerging in colonies in East Asia. So just to take April 1947 as one particular month that was particularly busy for Wang Shijie. On the 16th of, let me get the right round. On the 15th of April of that year of 1947, Wang Shijie notes that he's been negotiating a treaty of friendship with the Philippines, which of course had only become independent from the United States just a few months before, in mid 1946. He talked about the way in which they needed a trading agreement that would not interfere with the special relationship that the Philippines had established with the United States, even post-independence. He was also, to be honest, slightly patronizing about the newly emergent Philippine government, which he said, quotes, lacks experience and understanding, but nonetheless saw the establishment of a new trading relationship as an important part of creating intra-Asian links. The next day, the 16th of April, Wang Shijie receives Syngman Rhee, the Korean nationalist leader. His quote here on him is, talking of Syngman Rhee, his thinking is a bit conservative, which I think is a fairly mild way of putting the extraordinary reactionary views of that particular statesman. But nonetheless, he goes on and says, but nonetheless, his spirit of struggle is very strong. And then he adds, up to now, Korea has not had a government that's organized by the Korean people himself. And so Wang Shijie draws on this to write to George Marshall, who by now is, of course, Secretary of State of the US, the job he takes up after not managing to negotiate a peace in China. So Wang Shijie writes to George Marshall to encourage strongly the idea of an autonomous Korean government. And as we know, this goes on into the crisis that ultimately leads to the division of the peninsula, and 2 years later, the outbreak of the Korean War. So these sorts of meetings and encounters, Thailand, Philippines, Korea, there are plenty of others. Indonesia's independence leaders also contact the nationalist Chinese during this period. This feeds into the changing architecture of the region, but also creates new narratives around collective cross-Asian tasks, and in particular, economic development becomes a very, very strong driving force. The feeling that much of Asia has been devastated because of the Japanese occupation and war, and that new methods, some of them taken actually from initiatives undertaken under the old League of Nations in the 1930s, need to be picked up and given a new form of life. So one element, which I've written about elsewhere, is with a figure I've just mentioned a few minutes ago, Jiang Tingfu, the historian who has taken on to become a diplomat under Chiang Kai-shek and then given the role of coordinator for CINRA, the China National Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, which works with the new UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration in 1943 to 1947, to try and create a combination between a transnational and nationally driven set of institutions that not only will deal with immediate problems such as refugee flight, starvation, malnutrition, but also create an overall economic plan that can put China in some way on its post-war feet. And in fact, although China itself, as we know, doesn't end up going in that direction, many of the discussions and indeed personnel involved with those discussions become part of a wider Pan-Asian set or cross-Asian set of discussions, which amongst other things, leads to the institution of one of the first Asian UN institutions for development, for economic development, ICAFI, the Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East, which still exists, in fact, in a rather different form, based in Bangkok in the present day. We should also add that there were significant elements of although the Kuomintang, of course, are dominant in these discussions, there was a significant, if minor, attempt to try and bring some element of the CCP into the discussions, and in particular, the presence of Dong Biwu, one of the senior communist leaders, at the UN Charter negotiations in August 1945, were one part of that very short-lived attempt to try and put some reality into the idea of coalition actors. So we've got to about a few minutes to bring together some of the wider points that I want to bring in here. We are aware, of course, that the last years of this period are ones where any attempts that are made by Wang Shijie or others to make China into a genuinely global power, to make it into an Asian post-colonial leader, to make it into a power that has a strong cross-regional economic development narrative, a kind of, BRI version 1.0, all of these essentially come to grief on the basis of the reality of the geopolitics of the time. Truman and Marshall, and this is actually a very rare picture in which both Harry Truman and Madame Chiang Kai-shek, Su Mei-ling, are smiling at each other, since I think you don't need to know much about history to know that they were not fond of each other, I think is the way that I would put it. But I think they, on this occasion, decided they would both grin for the camera. And by the time, of course, the Republic of China, the Kuomintang government, moves to Taiwan, the top priorities in terms of their policies begin to change during this period. So, of course, the Korean War provides a new lease of life for what otherwise might have been a Taiwan rump state that essentially would have been abandoned by the Truman administration. I think I will not shock anyone in this room to say that famously Harry Truman referred to the Kuomintang regime as, quotes, the worst sons of bitches he had ever met. And he was known, I think, for his fruity language, but even that was going it some. Clearly the Korean War and the Cold War as a whole gave this new lease of life to Taiwan. There was also a strong turn in Taiwan itself to trying to create a cross-regional anti-communist post-colonialism. And again, some of the work that's been done by younger scholars, I mentioned actually my own former student, Yu Chim Lo, who's just published some wonderful work in the Journal of Contemporary History, and also other young scholars, Adrian Kwang is another one currently working at Oxford, on the way in which not just the socialist side, but also the anti-communist side had their own alliances between South Vietnam, the Republic of China, Taiwan, South Korea, and other major anti-communist actors at the time. There were also many debates over diaspora questions, ethnicity, and whether or not Chinese overseas, outside China itself, would be regarded as citizens of the newly established independent states or as part of a wider Chinese community. And then the arguments, which again become very well known, about developmental states in East Asia, linked, of course, with the idea of land reform. The irony that many will know that Taiwan's own land reform was rather successful in a way that the Kuomintang efforts to put one in place on the mainland never really were. But with all that said, why does it matter in the end that this ultimately unsuccessful regime on the mainland, the Kuomintang, actually did undertake this period of the Chinese post-war and set in motion trends that were, had it been successful, would have led in a very different direction for China? Well, just briefly put here, I think some of these, some of these shifts, I think, have continued to have resonance, and if not exactly continuity, at least a legacy that remain important in the present day. China's premier role at the United Nations and the formation of new norms and order matter. It's obvious, but worth saying, that were it not for that signing ceremony in 1945 and the actions of Wang Shijie, TV Song, and others, China would never have had the permanent Five Security Council seat that it has and operates in the present day under a different regime. And without that permanent five seat, China's contemporary international politics would be significantly different. As I said, the creation of a narrative that China ought to have, that there's a sort of moral basis on which it should have a regional and global role. Again, today's Ukraine negotiations, I think there's some echoes of that we see today. Territorial issues around the South China Sea, already mentioned, don't need to stress the point overly, but there's much continuity certainly in those disputes, not least acknowledged by the PRC itself. It's also a time of revolutionary renewal and identity, and I've downplayed that a little bit in what I've said here too, but it's worth remembering that both the Kuomintang and the CCP both thought that they were looking for projects to renew China in the post-war era, although those projects ended up being spectacularly different. Middle one and the green one in the middle there, I mean, the idea today that China, as it styles itself, is a global South leader, the G77 plus one, as they sometimes put it, in which China is both one of the global South, but also a plus one in that it's different and special. That idea of China as a leader for economic development is very much visible in the ideas on the developmental state and on being a new kind of economic exemplar that you see under Jiang Tingfu and others in the immediate post-war years. And then, broadly speaking, this idea of what I call moral ballast, the idea that China as a victor in World War II provides legitimacy for itself to take a role in the world. And although the post-1945 order right now as we speak, at the end of February 2025, seems in some ways to be under severe strain, there is no doubt that China itself still regards itself in some ways as a maintainer of that order that was created in 1945 in a way that it would never have done under Mao in 1949, when it sought to break it up. To finish off, two contrasts, two different aspects of where things have gone across the straits. Xi Jinping in 2021 promulgated the resolution on the major achievements and historical experience of the party. And this is something that, again, many in this room will know, happens very rarely. This is only the third, 1945, 1981, and then 2021 in terms of these big resolutions on historical questions. But compared to the others, noting the importance of the CCP's role as a world historical actor, I think is one of the things that's very central to this long and often quite complex document. But in many ways, one of the elements that continues to be a source of historical incompleteness in the narrative of today's CCP relates to things that are very much in the headlines today. And here I just sort of wipe that off or swipe that off the front page of CNN, where even just last week, I mean, again, there's been so much news since this morning, let alone last week, that you might have forgotten, but one of the big scandals of last week from Beijing's point of view was the shift on the State Department website, where the assurance of the United States that it holds to a one China policy was removed by the State Department for whatever reason from that particular website. And this led to a great deal of very angry criticism from Beijing in that particular case. Regardless of what resolutions, if any, we come to on what are still very live historical questions, the continued existence of Taiwan is a reminder of the very complex legacy of the period of the Republic of China, and if I leave you with one particular thought, which is the thought I think I'd like us to have leading into the discussion, it is that the importance and the legacy of Taiwan should not be considered merely in terms of its present status as an unrecognized state in East Asia with geopolitical crisis potentially behind a change of status, but also its status as an inheritor along with its whatever you want to call it, cousin state, sister state, I don't know quite what the relationship is, but the major state that sits across the states, the People's Republic, as inheritors of discourses and ideas that were first formed under the Kuomintang in the mainland, in the immediate Chinese post-war, and which continue to inform both of their trajectories as they move forward in their eighth or indeed ninth decade, I guess, in separation across the states. There is continuity as well as change, and much of what happened in the 1940s, I think, does still have resonance for understanding why the 2020s and 2030s are a period when understanding why China's agendas today are shaped by some of those earlier agendas on economics, modernization, territoriality, identity, and memory of war that were very raw and very keenly felt by Wang Shijie and others way back in the aftermath of World War II, at the beginning of an order which, if things go in a certain direction, may yet be crumbling before our eyes today. Thank you all very much.